A number of years ago, I went on vacation to the Grand Canyon. And one of the evenings, we took a shuttle bus out of the Grand Canyon Village, to a higher mountain or a place a little bit out of the city lights to look at the stars. And it was probably about midnight. And one of the things I remember was how it looked like there were so many more stars than we ever see around here, because the sky was that crisp and that clear. And there was a dad standing next to me, and he had a little girl who was maybe about 4 or 5 years old. And the dad says to the little girl, "Look at all those stars." And the little girl went, "Ooh, 1, 2, 3, 4. And I'm sure she probably ran out of numbers before she ever ran out of stars to count. But in today's first reading, we hear God also asking Abram to look at the stars. If we could look at the verses before the readings we see today, Abram and God are having this conversation. And God is reminding Abram of all the gifts that he is going to be given, all that he is going to inherit. And he says to God, "But that's not going to happen. Because in our old age, Sarah and I haven't even had any children. And so anything you give, what good is it going to do? Because it will just go to the children of my servants." But then God says to Abram, "No, look at the sky. Count those stars if you can. Your descendants will be as numerous as those stars." And can't you just see Abram's face? And maybe Abram even went, "Ooh, 1, 2, 3, 4. But then God continues in conversation with him, and his faith increases, and God says to him, "You are a person of righteousness." And righteousness means in right relationship with God. And so Abram's faith is beginning to increase. And then God says, not only the descendants, but look at all this land that I'm going to give you as well. And Abram says, "Well, how am I going to know? What will be my sign?" So God has Abram take animals, cut them in half, but rather than eat them or offer them in sacrifice like they normally would have done, he has Abram go into this deep trance. And the presence of God passes through those animals as a sign of the seriousness of God's commitment to the words he has just spoken, to that covenant promise with Abram. And then when Abram woke up, God says, "This is all of the land I am giving you." And again, if we could read a few verses afterwards, we know that Abram so trusted God, his faith so increased, that he left his homeland. He left everything familiar to him in order to follow the Lord. We have another powerful sign of God's presence today in the gospel. Every second weekend of Lent, we hear of the Transfiguration. And again, in the passages or the verses that would have preceded this, Jesus is talking to the disciples, and 3 times he tells them that he is going to have to suffer, to die, and then will be raised. But they don't want to listen to that. And so it says about 8 days later, Jesus took Peter, James, and John up the mountain to pray. And while they were up there praying, Jesus was so intense in his prayer that he physically changed. His face became different. His robe glowed in this dazzling white. And then suddenly Moses and Elijah appear. Can you imagine Moses and Elijah appearing? Now the disciples were drowsy, and so they were asleep. But when they wake up and see this, I'm sure they went, "Oh, ooh, wow." And Peter says, "It's good for us to be here, Lord. Let's build 3 tents. Let's stay here. There'll be a tent for you, a tent for Moses, and a tent for Elijah." Moses and Elijah represented the fullness of the Jewish tradition. Moses represented the law, and Elijah represented the message of the prophets. And as they're talking to Jesus, they're telling him about the exodus that he will have to go through in Jerusalem, that he will pass through those waters of death. And as Peter says, we need to stay here, this cloud comes over them and puts them in this great shadow, and they become a little afraid, and this voice comes from heaven saying, "This is my chosen son. Listen to him." And just like that, Moses and Elijah disappear. So that the disciples and us are reminded that Jesus is the voice we now listen to. Not just the traditions, not just stories from the past, but to listen to the message and the life and the words of Jesus Christ. Friends, hopefully we've all had those ooh moments in our lives, those times when we really felt the presence of God, when we were just like Jesus, so earnest in our prayer that we could feel ourselves somehow changing, when something happened in our prayer in our life that caused us to trust in God even more. Maybe it was in receiving one of the sacraments, maybe in seeing your bride or groom on the day of your wedding, maybe the birth of a child or a grandchild, maybe a beautiful sight in creation, maybe seeing someone pass from this life to the next. We've all had those moments, but sometimes in the busyness of life, in the ordinariness of life, we forget about those moments. Abram, the next morning, the stars weren't in the sky, and yet he knew the promise still remained. When Peter, James, and John came down the mountain with Jesus, Jesus had changed back into what he normally looked like. He still had on the ordinary robe, and yet they knew this powerful event had occurred. On Ash Wednesday, we were asked by the prophet Joel to turn our whole hearts over to God, to allow God to transform our hearts. And last week we heard that even at those times when we might feel closest to God, that we have those temptations that might tend to pull us away. And today we're reminded that through those times of temptation, to remember the amazing good things that God has done for us, all that we have been given, and to look to God and to fully put our trust in him, to remember those close moments, to create them again for ourselves in any way that we can, so that we might be those people who throughout the rest of this Lenten season can say that we have fully trusted God, enough like Abram to totally change our lives to follow in his ways.